Modern bread grows mold within days. Preservatives extend shelf life to a week, maybe two. Then decomposition becomes inevitable. Fuzzy, green colonies spreading across surfaces, converting wheat into waste. Medieval sourdough, baked with wild yeasts and long fermentation, remains edible for weeks without refrigeration. The crust stays crisp. The interior stays fresh. And mold cannot colonize the acidic environment. This is the story of a fermentation technology so sophisticated that modern microbiology is only now understanding how it works and why every loaf in your kitchen is designed to fail. Chapter 1. The loaf that dies in days. Open your bread bag. 3 days after purchase. Already you see the signs: slight softening of crust, subtle staleness in the interior, perhaps the first hints of white spots signaling mold colonization. By day 7, the mold is unmistakable. By day 10, the loaf is inedible garbage. This isn't unusual, it's the expected life cycle of modern bread. Commercial bread is optimized for softness, uniform texture, and rapid production. The dough is mixed, rises for 90 minutes with commercial yeast, and bakes. Total time from flour to finished loaf: 3 hours. The bread is soft and appealing but fundamentally unstable. The pH is neutral around 5.8 to 6.2, creating perfect environment for mold and bacterial growth. The moisture content is high, 3.842%, providing the water mold needs to grow. The crumb structure is open and fluffy, with large air pockets that mold easily penetrates. The bread has no natural antimicrobial protection. Manufacturers compensate by adding chemical preservatives, calcium propionate, sorbic acid that inhibit mold growth for several days. But the preservatives eventually deplete, and mold colonization becomes inevitable. The bread industry accepts this. Best buy dates, stamped on packages, acknowledge expected failure within 5 to 10 days. The business model depends on continuous replacement. If bread lasted a month, consumption would drop by 75%. Americans purchase 10 billion loaves of bread annually. If that bread lasted 4 weeks instead of 1, the industry would shrink to 1/4 its current size. Planned obsolescence isn't conspiracy, it's economic foundation. Meanwhile, in a bakery in San Francisco, a sourdough loaf made with 100-year-old starter culture sits on the counter. 4 weeks after baking, the loaf shows no mold. The crust is still crisp. The interior is drier than fresh bread, but not stale. It's concentrated with intensified flavor. The loaf could remain edible another month if protected from drying. The difference isn't magic, it's chemistry. Sourdough fermentation produces lactic and acetic acids that lower bread pH to 3.8 to 4.6, creating environment hostile to mold and pathogenic bacteria. The long fermentation, 12 to 48 hours, allows these acids to develop, while wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria create complex flavor compounds. The resulting bread is naturally preserved through its own chemistry. Chapter 2. The starter that lives forever. Sourdough begins with starter, a mixture of flour and water, colonized by wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria. This living culture perpetuates indefinitely through regular feeding. Discard half the starter, add fresh flour and water, let it ferment. Repeat. Starters can be maintained for decades or centuries. The Boudin Bakery in San Francisco has maintained their starter since 184917, 5 years of continuous culture. King Arthur Baking Company maintains starters over 100 years old. These aren't museum pieces, they're working cultures producing thousands of loaves weekly. The microbiological community in starter is complex. Dominant yeasts are typically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the same species as commercial baker's yeast, plus wild yeasts like Candida milleri and Kazakhstania exigua. These yeasts ferment sugars, producing carbon dioxide that makes dough rise. But sourdough's character comes from bacteria, primarily Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis and related species. These bacteria ferment sugars into lactic acid and acetic acid, creating the sour flavor and low pH that preserves the bread. The relationship between yeasts and bacteria is symbiotic. Yeasts break down complex carbohydrates, making simple sugars available to bacteria. Bacteria produce acids that inhibit competing organisms, protecting yeasts from contamination. Together, they create stable ecosystem that outcompetes pathogens and spoilage organisms. Medieval bakers didn't understand microbiology, but they understood starter maintenance. They knew that feeding starter regularly kept it vigorous. They knew that warm temperatures accelerated fermentation while cool temperatures slowed it. They knew that starter smelling pleasantly sour was healthy, while foul-smelling starter was contaminated. This knowledge was empirical, developed through centuries of observation. The Puritos Center for Bread Flavor in Belgium maintains a library of over 100 sourdough starters from around the world, some documented back to the 1600s. They've analyzed these starters microbiologically, finding that despite geographic diversity, all maintain similar microbial communities, evidence that sourdough fermentation selects for specific organisms regardless of origin. The fermentation creates environment that only certain microbes can tolerate. Those microbes, in turn, maintain the fermentation. Chapter 3. The fermentation that transforms grain. Modern bread dough ferments for 60 to 120 minutes, enough time for yeast to produce gas that makes dough rise, but insufficient for significant chemical transformation of the flour. Sourdough ferments for 12 to 48 hours, allowing extensive biochemical changes that fundamentally alter the bread's properties. The acids produced by bacteria, lactic acid primarily, plus some acetic acid lower pH dramatically. This acidity activates enzymes in the flour amylases that break down starches into sugars, proteases that break down proteins into amino acids. These enzymatic processes continue throughout fermentation, making nutrients more bioavailable and creating flavor compounds that short fermentation cannot produce. The pH also affects gluten development. In neutral pH dough, gluten forms strong elastic network that traps gas but creates chewy texture. In acidic sourdough, the gluten network is modified, still strong enough to trap gas, but more extensible, creating bread that's airy yet tender. The long fermentation also allows bacteria to break down phytic acid, an anti-nutrient in whole grain flour that binds minerals and prevents their absorption. Phytic acid reduction increases bioavailability of iron, zinc, and magnesium. Sourdough, whole wheat bread, provides more available minerals than yeasted whole wheat bread from the same flour. Studies at the University of Hohenheim in Germany compared nutritional content and digestibility of sourdough versus yeasted bread. Sourdough showed 20–30% lower phytic acid, higher levels of soluble fiber, and increased resistant starch. Starch that resists digestion in the small intestine and feeds beneficial bacteria in the colon. The fermentation had transformed the flour's chemistry, creating nutritionally superior product. The flavor is equally transformed. Long fermentation produces hundreds of volatile compounds, organic acids, alcohols, esters, aldehydes that create complex flavor, impossible in quickly made bread. Sourdough has deep, tangy notes with hints of nuttiness, fruit, or even cheese-like complexity depending on flour type and fermentation conditions. Commercial yeast bread tastes primarily of wheat and salt. The brief fermentation produces minimal flavor development. Chapter 4. The crust that armor plates. Sourdough bread develops extraordinarily thick, crisp crust, sometimes 3 to 5 millimeters thick, almost shell-like in its hardness when fully cooled. This crust isn't just textural preference, it's protective barrier. The thick crust forms through several mechanisms. The acidic dough increases Maillard reactions, chemical reactions between amino acids and sugars that create browning and flavor. Lower pH accelerates these reactions, creating darker, thicker crust. The extended fermentation also allows enzymes to break down starches on the dough surface into simple sugars. When the bread bakes, these surface sugars caramelize, creating additional crust development and gloss. Traditional baking techniques enhance this. Sourdough is typically baked in very hot ovens, 230 to 260 degrees Celsius, creating rapid surface drying. Steam injection during the first 10 to 15 minutes of baking keeps the surface moist, allowing maximum oven spring before the crust sets. When steam is released and crust forms, it's thick and impermeable. This crust acts as moisture barrier. It prevents water from the interior escaping rapidly, keeping the crumb moist longer. It also prevents mold spores from easily penetrating to the interior. Mold must first colonize the hard, dry crust before reaching the softer interior, a process that takes significantly longer than colonizing soft modern bread. The crust chemistry is also protective. The intense baking creates compounds with antimicrobial properties. Certain Maillard reaction products inhibit bacterial and fungal growth. The crust isn't just physical barrier, it's chemical defense. Tests at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology analyzed sourdough crust for antimicrobial activity. Extracts from heavily browned sourdough crust inhibited growth of several common mold species and pathogenic bacteria. The baking process had created natural preservatives in the crust. Modern commercial bread has thin, soft crust, typically 1 to 2 millimeters. This crust provides minimal protection and is often where mold first appears. The bread is optimized for softness throughout, sacrificing the protective barrier that thick crust provides. Chapter 5. The acid that conquers mold. The primary preservation mechanism in sourdough is acidity. The pH of 3.8 to 4.6 is low enough to inhibit most spoilage organisms. Most molds prefer neutral to slightly acidic environments, pH 5.5 to 7. Below pH 4.5, mold growth slows dramatically. Below pH 4, most common bread molds cannot grow at all. The acids in sourdough, lactic acid and acetic acid, are organic acids that penetrate cell membranes of microorganisms. Once inside, they dissociate into ions that disrupt cellular metabolism. Bacteria and molds attempting to colonize sourdough must constantly pump out these acid ions, expending energy that could otherwise support growth. Eventually, the energy cost exceeds what the organisms can sustain, and they die or remain dormant. This antimicrobial effect is selective. Pathogenic bacteria, Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, are inhibited at pH below 4.5. Beneficial bacteria in human digestive system are acid-tolerant and unaffected. The bread is preserved in ways that prevent harmful organisms while not interfering with digestive health. The ratio of lactic to acetic acid matters. Lactic acid provides mild sourness and good antimicrobial activity. Acetic acid, vinegar-like, provides stronger antimicrobial effect but more aggressive sour flavor. The ratio depends on fermentation conditions. Warmer fermentation, 2832 degrees Celsius, favors lactic acid production. Cooler fermentation, 1822 degrees Celsius, or stiffer dough, favors acetic acid. Medieval bakers discovered empirically that certain fermentation conditions produced bread that kept longer. They couldn't explain why, but they knew that cooler, longer fermentations created bread with more bite that resisted spoilage better. Modern analysis reveals they were increasing acetic acid production, enhancing antimicrobial properties. Research at the Technical University of Munich tested sourdough's preservative effects directly. They inoculated finished sourdough and commercial bread with Aspergillus, Penicillium, and other common mold species. The commercial bread showed visible mold growth within 3 to 4 days. The sourdough showed no growth for 14 to 21 days, depending on pH. The bread with pH below 4 resisted mold for over 3 weeks at room temperature. Chapter 6. The wheat that becomes medicine. Medieval physicians prescribed sourdough bread for digestive ailments. They couldn't explain why it worked, but clinical observation showed that people with stomach troubles tolerated sourdough better than quickly made bread. Modern gastroenterology has validated this folk medicine. Sourdough fermentation pre-digests components that cause digestive distress in sensitive individuals. The bacterial and enzymatic action breaks down complex proteins, making them easier to digest. For people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, sourdough often proves tolerable, even though it contains gluten. The fermentation modifies gluten structure in ways that reduce its potential to trigger symptoms. Studies at the University of Bari in Italy tested sourdough bread's effects on irritable bowel syndrome patients. Participants who struggled with commercial wheat bread tolerated sourdough with significantly fewer symptoms. The long fermentation had broken down FODMAPs, fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols that trigger digestive symptoms in sensitive individuals. The bread from the same wheat flour produced different physiological effects, depending on fermentation method. Sourdough also affects blood sugar response. The acidic environment slows starch digestion, resulting in lower glycemic index. Blood sugar rises more slowly after eating sourdough than after eating commercial bread. This is beneficial for diabetics and anyone concerned with blood sugar management. The acetic acid in sourdough appears particularly effective at reducing glycemic response. Research at Lund University in Sweden measured blood glucose levels after test subjects consumed sourdough versus yeasted bread. Sourdough produced 20–30% lower blood glucose spike. The difference was attributed to acetic acid's effect on gastric emptying and starch digestion rate. Medieval bakers serving sourdough to their communities were accidentally providing health benefits they couldn't articulate. The bread wasn't just preserved, it was medicinal in subtle but real ways. Chapter 7. The oven. That holds heat. Medieval bread was baked in wood-fired ovens, massive structures of brick or stone that held heat for hours. The oven would be fired for several hours, heating the masonry to 350 to 400 degrees Celsius. Once properly heated, the fire was removed, the oven floor swept clean, and bread loaded directly onto the hot stone. This method, retained heat baking, creates conditions impossible in modern ovens. The initial temperature is extremely high, 300 to 350 degrees Celsius, creating rapid crust formation. But the oven temperature drops continuously as heat radiates from the masonry. By the end of baking, temperature might be 180 to 200 degrees Celsius. This falling temperature profile creates specific effects. The high initial heat creates oven spring rapid gas expansion, making bread rise dramatically in the first 10 to 15 minutes. The declining heat allows interior to bake thoroughly without burning the crust. The result is bread with thick, dark crust and moist interior, exactly the properties that promote long shelf life. The masonry also creates different heat, radiant heat from the stone rather than convective heat from circulating air. Radiant heat penetrates the dough differently, creating more even baking and different crust characteristics. Bakers who've used both methods report that wood-fired masonry ovens produce superior crust development. Modern deck ovens attempt to replicate this by using heated stone or steel surfaces, but they can't match the thermal mass of a traditional oven. The retained heat baking also necessitates batch production. Once the oven is heated, you bake all the bread you've prepared because the oven cools over several hours. This encouraged medieval bakers to produce large batches weekly rather than small batches daily. A household might bake 10 to 20 loaves at once, storing them for the week or longer. This batch approach required bread that stayed edible for extended periods, providing additional incentive to develop preservation techniques like sourdough fermentation. Modern commercial baking uses continuously operated tunnel ovens. Bread travels on conveyor through temperature zones, baking as it moves. This enables constant production, but eliminates the specific thermal profile of retained heat baking. The bread bakes at constant temperature with forced air convection. Efficient, but producing different results than traditional methods. Chapter 8. The storage that breathes. Medieval bread storage was simple. Cloth bags, wooden boxes, or simply shelf storage in cool, dry pantries. The bread wasn't sealed. It remained exposed to air, allowing moisture to escape gradually. This seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't bread be sealed to prevent drying? For modern soft bread, yes. But for sourdough with thick crust, exposure to air is beneficial. The crust continues drying, becoming harder and more protective. The interior remains moist due to the crust barrier, but any excess moisture can escape, preventing the dampness that would encourage mold growth. The bread reaches equilibrium moisture content, typically 35–38%. That's low enough to inhibit mold, but high enough to maintain palatability. Storing bread in cloth allows this moisture exchange while protecting from dust and pests. The cloth breathes, preventing moisture accumulation while keeping the bread clean. Wooden bread boxes, traditional storage containers with ventilation holes, work similarly. Modern plastic bags prevent moisture escape. Bread sealed in plastic reaches 100% humidity inside the bag, perfect conditions for mold growth. The bread might stay soft slightly longer, but it molds faster. The convenience of sealed packaging creates the problem it claims to solve. Some traditional bread storage was even more sophisticated. In regions with very dry climates, parts of the Mediterranean, Middle East bread was stored in earthenware crocks with fitted lids. The earthenware absorbed excess moisture while protecting bread from drying too rapidly. In humid climates, bread boxes were made with better ventilation to prevent moisture accumulation. The storage adapted to local conditions, using materials and designs that modulated humidity appropriately. The Bread Museum in Ulm, Germany, documents historical bread storage methods from across Europe. Their collection includes dozens of bread storage containers, cloth bags, wooden boxes, ceramic crocks, woven baskets, each adapted to regional climate and bread type. The diversity reveals sophisticated understanding of moisture management, even though relative humidity and moisture content couldn't be measured. Medieval households managed these variables through observation and tradition. Chapter 9. The economic model of weekly baking. Medieval bread production operated on weekly or bi-weekly cycles. Households or communal ovens baked once or twice per week, producing enough bread to last until the next baking session. This required bread that remained edible for 7 to 14 days minimum. Sourdough met this requirement. The economic logic was straightforward. Firing a large oven required substantial fuel, typically a full day's wood collection. Doing this daily was economically impossible for most households. Doing it weekly was manageable. The batch production model required minimal daily labor, just starter feeding. On baking day, labor was intensive, mixing dough, shaping loaves, tending the oven, but concentrated into 1 day per week. This fit agricultural schedules where time was available in irregular blocks rather than uniform daily increments. Modern commercial baking operates continuously. Industrial bakeries run 24/7, producing thousands of loaves hourly. The economic logic is opposite: maximize throughput, minimize labor per unit. This requires fast production, 3-hour bread from mixing to packaging. Long fermentation doesn't fit the model. If sourdough takes 24 hours to ferment, production capacity drops dramatically. The equipment and space required to hold fermenting dough would be enormous. Industrial economics favor rapid production, even though rapid production creates inferior product. The cost difference is striking. Artisan sourdough, made with long fermentation and traditional methods, costs $6.12 per loaf. Industrial bread costs $2.04, but the sourdough lasts 3 to 4 weeks versus 7 to 10 days for industrial bread. Cost per week of edible bread: sourdough $1.50 3.0. Industrial bread $1.2.50. The price difference nearly disappears when accounting for usable life. Medieval bakers couldn't have articulated this analysis, but the economic reality shaped their methods. They baked bread that stayed edible because alternative daily baking was economically prohibitive. Modern consumers buy bread that spoils quickly because alternatives artisan sourdough cost more initially, even though lifetime costs are similar. Chapter 10. The baker who ferments. In Portland, Oregon, a baker named Ken Forkish operates a bakery using techniques indistinguishable from medieval practice. His bread ferments 12 to 18 hours. His starter is fed daily and originates from culture he created 15 years ago by leaving flour and water exposed to capture wild yeasts. His ovens are deck ovens that approximate retained heat baking through heated stone surfaces. Ken explains the contradiction. His methods are slower, more labor-intensive, and require more skill than commercial baking. Yet he maintains profitable business, selling bread at premium prices to customers who recognize the quality difference. His bread lasts 3 to 4 weeks. Customers discover they waste less bread and shop less frequently, factors that justify higher price. Ken's fermentation schedule means dough mixed. Monday morning isn't baked until Tuesday morning. This requires careful planning. He must anticipate demand 36 hours in advance. Mistakes mean unsold bread or disappointed customers. Commercial bakeries adjust production hourly. The inflexibility seems like disadvantage, but it forces discipline that improves quality. He maintains 7 different sourdough starters, each with distinct flavor profiles resulting from different feeding ratios, flours, and temperature management. The starters aren't interchangeable, each produces bread with characteristic taste. This diversity was standard in medieval baking, where each village or household had unique starter culture. The microbiological fingerprint of local environment influenced starter composition, creating regional bread characters. Ken has trained a dozen bakers over his career. 3 now run their own sourdough bakeries. The knowledge transfer is direct months of apprenticeship, watching, imitating, correcting mistakes. You cannot learn sourdough from recipes alone. The judgment of proper fermentation, correct dough consistency, appropriate shaping, these are tactile and visual skills requiring hands-on practice. His market is stable but niche. Portland has population of 650,000. Perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 regularly buy artisan sourdough, roughly 2% of the population. The other 98% buy supermarket bread, accepting shorter shelf life and preservatives as normal. The artisan baking movement is real but small. Whether it grows or remains niche depends on whether consumers increasingly value quality over convenience. Chapter 11. The chemistry that modern science rediscovers. Contemporary food science is extensively studying sourdough fermentation, documenting its chemistry and validating traditional practices. Research programs at universities worldwide are analyzing starter cultures, fermentation dynamics, and bread preservation mechanisms. The findings consistently validate medieval methods while revealing underlying mechanisms. A major study at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels characterized over 60 sourdough starters from across Europe, identifying their microbial communities and fermentation products. Despite geographic diversity, all starters converged on similar communities, evidence that sourdough fermentation selects for specific organisms regardless of starting conditions. The research confirmed that sourdough is a stable ecosystem once established. It resists contamination because the acid-producing bacteria outcompete potential pathogens and spoilage organisms. The system is self-protecting. Studies of fermentation kinetics revealed optimal conditions for acid production. Temperature around 28 degrees Celsius and hydration around 100%, equal parts flour and water by weight, maximize lactic acid bacteria activity. These happen to be the traditional parameters for maintaining starter. Medieval bakers discovered optimal conditions empirically. Research into antimicrobial compounds in sourdough identified dozens of molecules with antifungal and antibacterial properties, organic acids primarily, but also peptides produced by bacterial fermentation, cyclic dipeptides, and various other compounds. The bread is a complex chemical defense system against spoilage. The most significant recent finding is the role of specific bacterial species. Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis, the dominant bacteria in many sourdoughs, produces a compound called rheodorecyclin that inhibits mold growth. This compound is produced only during fermentation, not in the baked bread, but it leaves chemical residues that continue providing antimicrobial protection. Medieval bakers using sourdough accidentally cultivated bacteria that produced natural fungicides protecting their bread. The chemistry worked, even though the microorganisms and molecules were invisible and unknown. Modern food manufacturers are exploring application of these findings, using sourdough cultures to create clean label bread, no synthetic preservatives, with extended shelf life. Some success has been achieved, though challenges remain in scaling traditional methods to industrial production volumes. Chapter 12. The preservative that replaced fermentation. In the 1960 seconds, industrial baking adopted calcium propionate as standard preservative. This compound calcium salt of propionic acid inhibits mold growth, extending bread shelf life from 3 to 4 days to 7 to 10 days. The benefits seemed obvious: reduced waste, improved distribution logistics, happier consumers. But calcium propionate created dependency. Instead of bread naturally resistant to mold through fermentation chemistry, bread required chemical addition to prevent spoilage. The bread's inherent properties hadn't changed. It was still neutral pH, high moisture, perfect mold substrate. The preservative was bandage masking the bread's fundamental instability. Research in the 1990 seconds and 2000s raised concerns about preservatives. Some studies linked calcium propionate to behavioral issues in children, though results were inconsistent. Other concerns involved allergic reactions and digestive sensitivities. The compounds weren't acutely toxic, but were novel synthetic chemicals whose long-term health effects remained uncertain. Consumer pressure led to preservative-free bread, marketed as healthier alternative. These breads reverted to 3 to 4 day shelf life, requiring more frequent shopping or acceptance of waste. The improvement had become necessary because the underlying bread chemistry was poor. Removing the preservative revealed the problem it was masking. Some manufacturers responded by using sourdough cultures, not traditional long fermentation, but addition of dried sourdough powder or acid whey. These provided some pH reduction and flavor notes without requiring extended fermentation. The result was compromise bread slightly more resistant to mold, with hint of sour flavor, but without the full benefits of traditional sourdough. True sourdough's preservation doesn't come from additives, it comes from the fermentation process itself. The acids are produced by bacteria as natural byproducts. They're distributed throughout the bread at concentrations that prevent mold while contributing flavor. There's no ingredient to remove because the preservation is intrinsic to the method. The philosophical difference is fundamental. Add chemicals to fix problems versus use processes that prevent problems. Industrial baking added chemicals. Traditional baking used processes. One approach creates dependency on continuous inputs. The other creates inherent stability. Chapter 13. The regulation that complicated tradition. Traditional bread production involved selling bread directly to consumers without packaging or ingredient labeling. The bread was what it was: flour, water, salt, starter. Everyone understood this. Modern food regulations require ingredient labeling, nutritional analysis, and safety certifications. These regulations serve legitimate purposes. Consumers should know what they're eating, and food safety is a serious concern. But regulations written for industrial food production often complicate or prohibit traditional practices. For example, regulations may require listing all bacteria species present in starter culture. Traditional bakers don't know this. They maintain starter cultures through feeding, not laboratory analysis. Requiring species identification means expensive microbiological testing that small bakeries cannot afford. Some jurisdictions regulate fermentation times, requiring that fermentation occur within specific temperature and time ranges to prevent pathogenic bacterial growth. These regulations assume industrial yeast production, not sourdough fermentation. Sourdough's acid production prevents pathogen growth, even during long fermentation, but regulations don't distinguish. Cottage food laws often prohibit selling bread made in home kitchens. All commercial bread must come from licensed commercial facilities. This prevents traditional home bakers from legally selling bread, requiring investment in commercial facilities that many cannot afford. Some jurisdictions require chlorinated water for all food production, but chlorine kills sourdough starter. Traditional bakers using well water or dechlorinated municipal water technically violate regulations, even though the practice is safer for fermentation. These regulations create barriers to traditional baking. The regulations aren't malicious, they're written for industrial production and applied universally. But universal application ignores that traditional methods have different risk profiles than industrial methods. Reform would require creating regulatory categories for traditional fermented foods, acknowledging that acid fermentation provides safety through different mechanisms than industrial quality control. Some regions have done this. The European Union's Traditional Specialty Guaranteed designation protects traditional production methods. But most jurisdictions apply one-size-fits-all, regulations that favor industrial production. Chapter 14. The revival that's accelerating. Artisan bread baking is experiencing renaissance. Bakeries specializing in naturally leavened bread are opening in cities worldwide. Sales of artisan bread grow 10–15% annually. Small compared to industrial bread market, but consistent growth trend. The movement is driven by multiple factors: health concerns about preservatives and refined flour, environmental awareness of industrial food systems, recognition of quality differences, and simple desire for better-tasting bread. Consumers trying genuine sourdough often become converts. The flavor difference is striking. Social media amplifies the movement. Instagram and TikTok are full of home bakers, documenting their sourdough journeys, mixing starter, fermenting dough, scoring loaves, sharing results. The visibility creates cultural momentum. Sourdough baking, once obscure craft, becomes aspirational hobby. The trend has challenges. Many sourdough breads in supermarkets are industrial bread with sourdough flavoring added, no long fermentation, no natural preservation. The term isn't legally protected, allowing misleading marketing. True sourdough and industrial imitation coexist, confusing consumers. Educational resources proliferate. Books, websites, videos explaining sourdough technique are abundant. The knowledge is accessible to anyone motivated to learn. Barrier isn't information, it's patience. Sourdough requires time. Starter development takes weeks. Fermentation takes days. Modern culture prioritizes speed. Sourdough demands patience. This creates filter people willing to work slowly, discover authentic practice. Those seeking quick results abandon the effort. The community that forms around sourdough baking is supportive and knowledge-sharing. Online forums where experienced bakers help beginners. Local groups organizing bread shares and workshops. Bakeries offering classes. The culture values skill sharing over proprietary secrets. Whether this revival becomes mainstream shift or remains enthusiast movement depends on cultural factors beyond bread itself. If slow food, traditional methods, and quality over convenience continue gaining cultural acceptance, sourdough could regain significant market share. If speed and price remain dominant consumer priorities, sourdough remains niche. Chapter 15. The bread that waits. You can make sourdough. The starter requires only flour, water, and time. Mix equal parts. Let it ferment. Feed daily for a week. Wild yeasts and bacteria will colonize the mixture, creating active starter culture. From there, thousands of recipes guide you through mixing, fermenting, shaping, baking. The knowledge is free and abundant. The barriers are time and patience. Starter takes a week to establish. Dough takes 12 to 24 hours to ferment. You cannot rush chemistry. Either you accommodate the timescale, or you don't make sourdough. Medieval bakers had no choice. Fast commercial yeast didn't exist. They worked with fermentation's natural pace, because no alternative existed. We have alternatives: instant yeast, rapid rise formulas, 3-hour bread. These compete with sourdough for our attention and time. Choosing sourdough means rejecting convenience in favor of quality. That choice reveals values. The bread that never molds is still possible. The chemistry works. The techniques are documented. The microorganisms exist in flour and air, waiting to be cultivated. What's required is patience, willingness to work on fermentation's timeline, not ours. Medieval bakers didn't have preservatives, refrigeration, or plastic packaging. They had time and fermentation. The bread they produced outlasted modern bread by weeks, without any additives. We have technology medieval bakers couldn't imagine, yet we produce bread that spoils in days. We've optimized for speed and sacrificed stability. The bread is waiting in starter cultures, maintained across generations, in techniques documented across centuries, in chemistry that works regardless of whether we understand or value it. It will outlast you, will outlast your grandchildren. We'll still be fermenting in kitchens when your great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren are baking bread. The question is whether we're patient enough to use it.